ACU students. In this presentation, I will explain how to interpret Turnitin reports and how to avoid plagiarism in your own papers. What is plagiarism? Here is a simple explanation of plagiarism. You plagiarize even when you do credit the author but use his exact words without so indicating with quotation marks or block indentation. You also plagiarize when you use words so close to those in your source that if your work were placed next to the source, it would be obvious that you could not have written what you did without the source at your elbow. A breakdown of what constitutes plagiarism is changing verb tenses, copying and pasting phrases, or swapping certain words for their synonyms while leaving the sentence structure the same. So if you were to plagiarize the definition that I just went over, this is what it would look like. You can see some synonym swaps, some changes in words, but the overall sentence structure is the same. And here is how it would look in Turnitin. As you can see, Turnitin highlights the words or phrases that were taken from the original text. So the sections in blue is what Turnitin would highlight, and then the black text indicates what the student wrote. So one lesson that I want to reiterate in this presentation is to avoid relying on percentages or certain colors in Turnitin. Basically, the colors are determined by percentages. So something like 10 or 20% might be green, 30 to 50% might be yellow, and then something high like 70 or 80% might be red. But again, I want to emphasize that you shouldn't rely only on the percentage. You may have been told that a low number like below 20 or 10% is okay, but I don't agree with this because of several reasons. First, the percentages and their corresponding colors in Canvas by themselves do not tell you much. Why? Because the percentage is determined by the length of the paper. So if you have a long paper or a dissertation chapter, and maybe you plagiarized one or two sentences or paragraphs, you may have a low percentage in the report, but that doesn't mean that the paper doesn't have plagiarism. In your different courses, there might be different Turnitin settings. So you may work with Turnitin in your dissertation course or specific assignment, but they may not all have the same settings. So you could set Turnitin to include quotations and list of references, or you could set it not to include them, and that's going to affect the percentage. So you may have, variability in the overall percentage score. So that makes the percentage by itself not necessarily reliable because it's going to change based on the specific settings in that course. And as I said before, for long papers and dissertation chapters, because they are longer, even if you plagiarize one or two paragraphs, which is pretty bad to have in a dissertation, you may still get a low percentage. So if you don't actually click on the report and go through the report, you may not know that you plagiarized a section. Because the Turnitin percentage score depends on the settings in that particular assignment within a specific course, the same paper submitted to the Writing Center versus to a specific course might get a different similarity score in Turnitin. That's why the best way to check your paper for plagiarism is to simply open up the Turnitin report and check what has been highlighted. For instance, if Turnitin has highlighted your quotations or your list of references, you can ignore those sections because you know that per APA guidelines, those are not a form of plagiarism. So in this section, I will show you how to interpret various reports because sometimes it can be kind of confusing and it's not clear-cut. If you did have to use a number, I know I just told you not to rely on a specific number, but if you do have to have a number, I would say check any report really carefully that's higher than 5%. So if you see any percentage in Turnitin that's higher than 5, I would say go through the actual report and look at your paper carefully, see what has been highlighted. So common issue that I find with working with students at the Writing Center is this issue of what's called patchwork plagiarism. So basically the student is trying to paraphrase, but they paraphrase too close to the original. And quite often they do use citations, so they're not doing anything, intentionally. They're trying to paraphrase, they're trying to cite their source correctly, but they're just doing it so close to the original, they don't change the sentence structure, so it results in plagiarism. And I'll show you some examples. Some caveats to this issue is when interpreting the report, you can ignore some commonly used phrases that are highlighted, and I'll show you some examples of that as well. Or sometimes when you're using complex variables that consist of multiple words, you may not be able to paraphrase those words because they're kind of commonly accepted terms in your field. So in those cases, Turnitin might highlight that, but you don't have to change it. And again, I'll show you some examples of that. So let's go over some potentially false positives or highlights that you may have to kind of disregard when interpreting the report. So here you can see that this is an annotated bibliography and the percentage is 14%. You can see the percentage has gone up to 14% because for whatever reason, even though my settings were set not to highlight bibliography, it has highlighted the bibliography. So you can definitely disregard this top part. That's not plagiarism, it's your reference entry, so that's okay. Here, this is an example of what I was saying, that some commonly used phrases in the field might be hard to paraphrase. You can see the mediating roles of psychological empowerment and willingness to take risks. So the student is summarizing a source, and there's not really a good way to paraphrase this because these were the variables in the study and they're very specific descriptions of what was measured in the study. So if the student were to change these words completely, the meaning would be lost. So this is an example of a false positive where you can disregard it. Here is another example from a dissertation. You can see that it's highlighting commonly used terms that you see in any table of contents. So this is a good example of it's a false positive and you can ignore the highlight. This is another example of a false positive, and the reason is if you look closely, it's commonly used terms. Many general education teachers are teaching students with disabilities. So it's highlighting kind of, again, these are variables or commonly used phrases, and you can see they're from different sources. So it's not like the student copied pasted something from an original and just swapped the synonyms. So this would be okay. This is not plagiarism. Here's another example. A lot of times when you're writing your dissertation, you may have to use surveys or instruments that were used in other studies, or sometimes you have to report demographic data as it's illustrated here, and there may be some commonly used ways of breaking up the demographic information, and you can, which has been used in different studies, which is why Turnitin is highlighting it from another source. But again, you're reporting data from your own studies, so here is an example where it would be okay that it's highlighted and you can just ignore the highlight. This is another example. Again, it's highlighting commonly used phrases, and they're all from different sources. So again, it's a false positive. Here, this is a false positive because, again, it's those variables that I was referring to. The student is using variables, which are certain phrases from their field, and they're using those variables because that's what they measured in their research question, and Turnitin is highlighting those. So these variables that the student is studying are probably pulled from the literature in that field, so Turnitin is pulling it up from other sources. But again, this is part of the student's original research question, and the variables happen to be a series of words that are used together. So that's why Turnitin is pulling it up. So now we're moving into examples of patchwork plagiarism, something that you would have to avoid when you're interpreting the Turnitin reports in your own papers. So in Turnitin, when you see something is highlighted, you can just click on that number. It usually numbers each source, and you will see that each source will be in a different color. And you can just click on the number and you will see a pop-up window as illustrated here that pulls up the original source, either article or website where this information was pulled from. So you can see here the issue is that the student has copied pasted the original sentence and just taken out or changed a few words, but the sentence structure is the same. So the student has paraphrased too close to the original. Now I want to let you know that the only time that you may see section highlighted but the original information is not being pulled up is if it highlights a student paper. So because of privacy issues, Turnitin does not show you the original student paper where the information was pulled up. Here is another clear example of plagiarism. You can see the student copied pasted the original phrase. It's almost like a full sentence, actually most of the sentence. The student put it in their own paper. And this is what I mean when I say mostly it's unintentional. You can see the student is citing the source with parenthetical citations. However, the student did not use quotations. So if you do not use quotations, it means you're pretending that it's your own language, even though it's not. That's where it's considered plagiarism. There are two ways that the student could have avoided plagiarism here. The student could have included quotations starting from is and at the end of the sentence. And of course, the student would have to correct the in-text citation to include a page number, because in APA you do have to provide the page number when quoting. Another way the student can fix this is by simply paraphrasing, so keeping the original meaning of the original source but using their own words and their own sentence structure. Here is another example. You can see it's not the full sentence, but it's part of a sentence, but it's still considered plagiarism because the student just copied pasted from the original without providing quotations, which means again, you're taking credit for somebody else's sentences. This is a clear example of plagiarism. You can see all the red sections are from a source. So the student kind of just copied pasted the original, put a little bit of their own words in between, but all the red sections are copied and pasted from a source. So that's definitely an example of clear plagiarism. Here is another example, again, copying, pasting without quotations. So there's nothing here to indicate to the reader that this information was taken from a source. Of course, there is, again, these in-text citations, but there's no quotations, which means the student is taking credit for the sentence, the text, and saying these are my own words when they're not. So that's also considered plagiarism. Before sharing some resources with you on how to address any plagiarism issues you may find in your papers, I wanted to remind you that there are other types of plagiarism that have not been covered in this presentation. So in this presentation, I have covered copying and pasting without using quotation marks, and paraphrasing too close to the original, which is changing a few words, which is called patchwork plagiarism. However, there are other kinds of plagiarism, such as not including parenthetical citations or including incorrect citations. Even if you change the words and you paraphrase a source, but if you do not include in-text citations per APA guidelines, that would also be considered plagiarism. In this final section, I want to share some resources you can use to address any plagiarism issues and learn how to integrate sources properly. First, the Writing Center APA page has many resources on integrating sources, including using Zotero, which is an automatic citation tool, to add in-text citations to your paper in a quick and easy way. And there are a series of videos that I created on that related to how to use Zotero with the APA manual to ensure proper APA citations. Of course, there's many resources on source integration. One of the best ones is this one, which is from the Seagull Handbook, which includes examples of how to integrate sources using proper signal phrases, but there are many others, including videos. And of course, there's additional resources, including the Walden University APA website, as well as Walden's YouTube channel, which has many great videos and resources on source integration. Note that the ACU Student Handbook does include a section on academic honesty. As you can see in the handbook, a definition of plagiarism includes both intentional and unintentional plagiarism. It also includes number 2, asserting ideas without acknowledging their source, which is what I explained when I said even when you paraphrase, if you don't include in-text parenthetical citations, it could still be considered plagiarism. And of course, there are other kinds that I didn't go over. Number 3, submitting other people's work for credit or submitting works by using outside services. They often call them paper mills or just services where somebody else writes your paper for you.